Would mean for you? Morning, Alice.
Morning,
I mean, the problem with all of this is, unless we go out and get a new copy of the Highway Code, it all seems a bit confusing at the moment.
Hi there, good morning. I mean, absolutely. I mean, if you're waking up today thinking, I didn't know anything about these changes, you're not alone. I mean, the AEA did a poll recently which showed 1 in 3 motorists didn't know anything about it. But we're hoping to give a little bit of clarity today about what the changes are and what they mean for motorists or cyclists or indeed pedestrians. And I'm joined today by Duncan Dollimore from UK Cycling. Thanks very much for joining me. Talk me through the changes, I guess, from a cycling perspective, what they are and what the sort of impact really is.
Well, the biggest change is probably a bit of a cultural change rather than one of the specific rules about a particular thing. It's the introduction of something called the hierarchy of users or hierarchy of responsibilities. And that's just simply enshrining in the code the principle that the person in charge of the largest vehicle, the one that has the most capacity to cause harm in the event of a collision, they have the greater responsibility. If you think about that, that's really just saying the driver of a 44-ton lorry has more responsibility than a 7-year-old on the pavement. It's not that the pedestrian has no responsibility for their own safety, but it's just confirming that if you're in charge of something which can cause harm to others, you have the greater responsibility. So a cyclist has more responsibility, for example, than a pedestrian. And that's something which we've never had in the code before, which affects all the other rules as well.
Absolutely. So that's quite a big change. And another change I wanted to ask you about was at junctions, this idea that drivers and also cyclists have to give way to pedestrians who are wanting to cross over at junctions. I mean, I was sort of wondering, well, does that mean that if anyone could just sort of cross over the road? I mean, have you got any clarity on that?
Well, until yesterday, we had 14 different rules that covered this issue of who has priority, or who gives way to whom at junctions. And that's why 70%, 75% of collisions with cyclists took place at junctions. It's a similar figure in relation to pedestrians. So they are the most dangerous place on our roads. What we've done is followed the situation that most of Northern Europe has. We now have a single rule for junctions without traffic signals, which is if you're turning left, you give way to something going straight ahead. That means if you're driving and turning left in your car at an unsignalised junction, you give way to the pedestrian that's crossing the road or the cyclist in the cycle lane that you're cutting across. That's the principle behind it. And it impacts cyclists as well, because the cyclist turning left now has to give way to the pedestrian that's crossing the road. Best way to think about this is to imagine that huge bell-mouth forecourt entrance that you might have to a petrol station, where you've got sort of 40 metres to cross. Perhaps you're a mum with a pram and you're pushing it across, and somebody drives into that, and you have that moment where you wonder whether you're supposed to break into a trot and get out of the way of the driver. What this rule says is, no, you're crossing. The driver is supposed to give way to you to allow you to cross that junction.
OK, well, it seems like there's a lot in these changes that are going to improve life for cyclists. But there are, of course, a lot of motorists who may be watching this sort of saying, well, OK, it's all very well, I'm going to be giving way to cyclists if I want to turn left or right. OK, fine. But this issue about cyclists and cycle lanes, not having to use them, I mean, that's a lot of motorists will feel quite frustrated, particularly if they've got their taxes going into having, you know, updated cycle lanes, but cyclists not having to use them. I mean, some would say this code's not going far enough in protecting drivers in that capacity.
Well, the problem we've had over the last week or 10 days is there's been a lot of miscommunication about the code changes, and that's fostered a bit of division in relation to different user groups. It's worth bearing in mind that the vast majority of people who cycle have also got a driving licence and are drivers as well. Now, the reality is there is no change in relation to the issue of whether or not cyclists have to use a cycling facility if it exists. The reality is that almost every cyclist I know will use a cycle lane if it's there, if it's decent quality, if it's separated from traffic, if it's maintained. If it lasts for 20 metres, gets to a junction, and then starts again and lasts for 10 metres, like some that we've had that were not badly designed, then people don't use them. The code's not changed in relation to any of that. What we should have had, though, is a clearer communication to drivers that these were coming, because some of the rule changes were designed to explain why things happened, to explain to drivers, for instance, that sometimes a cyclist might be riding in the middle of the lane rather than hugging the curb on the left as they approach a junction. It wasn't telling the cyclist to do that, it was explaining to the driver why that might happen. But we haven't had the big public communication campaign, awareness campaign, that we should have had before these changes came in.